I'm gonna check my.
Ready? All right. So I see our participants are, we have 9 participants thus far, so people will start clicking in now that we're live. So we're just going to take a few minutes and let people arrive, and then I'll share it to Facebook as well.
Great.
Welcome, everybody. We're just getting the live stream up and going and letting people arrive, and we'll get started in a couple minutes. We have 29 participants and counting. Welcome, everybody. Yep, we're just waiting for the Facebook Live to kick in.
Sure.
And we will remember to, we're recording, so video will be saved for those who check it out later on Building Faith. Oh, hi, Laura from Baton Rouge. Thank you for being here today. Restart streaming. All right, we're going to try again on Facebook Live. 34 participants. Welcome, everybody. All right, we'll try Facebook Live again. Wendy from Yamama, Washington. Welcome. Thanks. "35 participants. Welcome, everybody. We're just getting the Facebook live stream going as well to the Lifelong Learning Facebook page. So we're just going to give that a minute and let people arrive, and we'll start in a minute. Feel free to say hi in the chat. There's a couple ways you can interact with us. You can correspond with us in the chat box, and you can also, that's at the bottom, you'll see. Hi, Jeanette. Jeanette and I go, this is like a Redeemer reunion. So Diane and I were at Lutheran Church of the Redeemer in Woburn, and Jeanette's mom was a member there. Yeah. Good to see you. So we have people who are saying hi here. Question, will your audio stay muted? Yes. So everybody, all the attendees' audio will be muted, so you'll just be able to hear me and our presenters, but you can interact with us using the chat box and the Q&A function. Either one works. So as we have our presentation today, Facebook doesn't want to seem to cooperate. I'll go back to our slides. So as we go through the presentation today, you can answer, you can ask a question using the chat box or the Q&A, and I'm going to monitor those throughout our time. And so we'll take time to pause throughout, and then I'll share the questions with Greg and Diane, and we'll be able to respond to you in that way. We have some more people who are still joining, so we'll give it another minute and let people arrive, and we'll try Facebook share one more time. We have 39 participants now.
Wow.
All right. Well, Facebook will decide whether it wants to work or not. We'll let that work in the background and come back to our slides. And it's a few minutes after 3, so why don't we get started? So welcome everybody to this Wisdom from the Field webinar that is hosted by Virginia Theological Seminary, and specifically the Department of Lifelong Learning. I'm Keith Anderson, and I'm the Associate for Digital Content for Lifelong Learning at VTS, and I'm the host of our webinar today. We'll probably go till around 4 o'clock. Sometimes we go over. That happens when we're talking about such good stuff with such great presenters. We'll invite you to follow along. If you have to leave early, just know that since you're here on the webinar with us, you will automatically get a notification when the materials from the webinar are available. We're going to post the video, we're going to post the slides, and we're going to post links to the resources that we talk about, all on our Building Faith website. So you'll be able to access those later on if you need to leave early, or if you just want to go back and check in or share it with others from your church. So let's go ahead and get started. As I said, this is brought to you by Virginia Theological Seminary, and we host monthly webinars on the 3rd Thursday of the month at 3 o'clock. That's a lot of threes. And we alternate between kind of practical ministry advice through Building Faith, and then more digitally oriented resources through our eFormation learning community. Next month, for instance, we'll have a webinar on being church beyond the building with Kyle Oliver and Emily Scott, which will be really great in January. So more information on that a little later as we wrap up the webinar as well. But let's begin with scripture and prayer. Reading from Hebrews 13, let mutual love continue. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing that some have entertained angels without knowing it. Let us pray. Lord our God, source of all life, you reveal yourself in the depths of our being, drawing us to share in your life and love. Bless each of us as we respond to your Spirit's invitation to open wide the doors to Christ. Make the doors of our hearts, our homes, and communities wide enough to receive all who need human love and fellowship, narrow enough to shut out all envy, prejudice, and pride. Let us hasten to welcome the stranger and so welcome your Son. We make this prayer in his name, Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Well, we have a couple of wonderful presenters that are here with us today to talk about welcoming the visitor, especially at the holiday season, and we're going to talk about the holidays and beyond today. Our presenters are Greg Milliken, who is the vicar at Grace Episcopal Church in New Lenox, Illinois. And prior to this position, he was the associate rector at St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Alexandria, and is a graduate of Virginia Theological Seminary. His new book, Being Called and Being Gay, just came out by Church Publishing in October of this year, so congratulations, Greg. Please check that out. We understand there's high demand on Amazon. It's sold out at the moment, but more supplies are coming in. So check out that great resource. We could do a whole nother webinar on that. Maybe we should. We have Diane Young with us, and Diane has worked for a dozen years welcoming visitors and newcomers to churches, first at the Lutheran Church of the Redeemer in Woburn, Massachusetts, which is where we serve together. She was our deacon, and I was the pastor there, and we actually created that position and worked together on that for several years. And most recently, she has been the Director of Community Engagement at the First Religious Society, UU, in Newburyport, Mass. And as I said, I'm Keith Anderson, Associate for Digital Content at Lifelong Learning, and I also am the pastor at Upper Dublin Lutheran Church in Ambler, Pennsylvania. And here's our contact information, and so we're all available if you have questions following the webinar and would like to follow up with us. We're available to do that as well. If you think of something following the webinar that you want to talk with us more about, or maybe one-to-one rather than in the forum of the webinar space. So our flow today is going to be, Diane is going to start us off, and then Greg is going to respond to her, and then we'll open it up to questions and comments. And then after your questions and comments, Greg is going to present, Diane will respond, and then we'll do Q&A again. So we're going to have some chunks of content, but then we're going to break up some of the content to make sure that we're answering your questions. We want to be as helpful to you as we can in this time. Okay, so with that, let us get started, and I'm going to pass it over to Diane.
Hi, everybody. It's great to be with you this afternoon. I have a disclaimer to begin with. The last church that I worked at was Unitarian Universalist, so if you hear me talk about things that seem to be God optional, no, that's why. I'm presuming that most of you are in Christian churches, but don't be alarmed. So we had sort of a different range of activities, which I may refer to, so I want to let you know that that might be coming up. I want to tell you a piece of my story, as I've done this work for a dozen years. When I started working with Keith, called as deacon for Newcomers Ministry, after some short amount of time, I had a crushing realization, and that was that everyone is different and nothing is straightforward. You can imagine how this made my life difficult as a kind of Excel spreadsheet person. Like, I wanted everything chunk, 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 chunk. My plan was, and perhaps you can relate to this, that people would visit, then they would come back, then they would integrate themselves, and then they would become a member. And it was very frustrating to me to find out that that's not how it really works. I feel like sometimes we perceive this relationship between the visitor and the church as a kind of courtship, where we have to look our best, we have to give them everything they're looking for, kind of like a blind date that we didn't even know we were going to have, but we're just trying to win them over. And that's especially a pressure, I think, if our churches are small or our membership is declining. And if that doesn't play out the way we expect it to, we have feelings of failure. So let's think about what really happens when someone comes into a church. What about the person who wants to sit in the back pew and not be bothered and just commune with God? What about the person who gets really intensely involved with your congregation and then disappears? What about a guy I know who was really tentative about talking to people? He didn't even want to come to the service, but he really loved being in the kitchen to serve coffee. And he did that continuously for a couple of years. What about Rachel, who came from another church, and before she ever came to our church, she had signed up for a teacher's training so that she could be a teacher on day one. This is where we see that everyone is different. Everyone's on their own path, and we have to be able to respond to that instinctually and graciously, and not try to set people along a predetermined path that we have in the back of our mind. So I want you to ask yourself now or at some point later, what are your assumptions about what success means when you're welcoming a visitor? And to really articulate that perhaps in a conversation with some other people in your congregation. What expectations have we put upon ourselves? And think about what really happens and know that you are doing the ministry you need to do, even if that plan does not come to fruition. As we all know, I think people come to churches because they've had a crisis, their life is in transition, say they've just moved to your town, the family member has an illness, they've retired, they've just had kids. And so the way we're ministering to them for that hour that they're with us or for the time to come is really in response to that. And we just have to jettison our preconceptions about it. So that was my really hard lesson that I learned at the beginning of this ministry to newcomers that I've been doing for a dozen years. So again, I want you to ask yourselves, what are your assumptions about what success looks like with visitors? And then also an interesting question is, how assertive are you willing to be? I think a lot of our churches are somewhat introverted. We don't want to push ourselves on people. And that's something you have to figure out about your own culture and what you think your congregants are comfortable with, what you're comfortable with, what you think your visitors, your typical visitor is comfortable with. I want to move to my next topic, which is to be ready with the next ask. And this is something I learned from Carrie McDonald of the Unitarian Universalist Association. When you have someone coming to your church, you need to immediately capitalize on their enthusiasm, and you want to give them a reason to come back. So this is, for instance, if you're having your Christmas service, you've got something in your bulletin that says, and the next great thing we're having, which is not your usual Sunday service. It's your climate action program, it's your crafts program, it's your whatever. And if you're a smaller church and you don't have a lot of events coming up, turn your ordinary things into events is my recommendation. Like, okay, we're all getting together to take down the Christmas decorations and bring your lunch. You know, just make something look like an event so that people have another opportunity to get to know you and to be in community with you. I had the advantage of, in a church of about 400 members, when I met with visitors, I had a handout of about 30 activities. So it was real easy for me to say, here's something you might want to try, here's something you might want to try. But if we don't have very full calendars, we still need to come up with something to keep the ball rolling with people. And that also means that when they come to the next thing, you have another thing to invite them to. So that's something to pay attention to, especially now that you've got, what, a week and a half before Christmas? Get on that right away and plan those next asks. I'd like to talk about following up with visitors. And so maybe some of my information is contradictory, but that's the world, right? I do really recommend that you track all of your visitors so you make sure that you're following up with them in every way that's positive for them. And the first thing that I do is email them in the next couple of days. You don't want to lose any time and forget about them. Email them or call them in the next couple of days. Extend an invitation to coffee, and tell them about the next thing coming up, and offer some other things to them. So, and this invitation to coffee, to me, is really critical. Sometimes at the church I worked with at Keith, I would invite people to lunch right after church. People were always really happy to go. So know that people will respond positively to this offer. When I meet with people, or other members of our congregation meet with people over coffee, the deliberate intent, which we tell the person, is we want to hear your story, and we want to see how we can help you. And if you're trying to figure out if this is a place for you, we'll help you discern that. And unlike the courtship model, where we're trying to present ourselves as our best possible selves and we're trying to be everything to everyone, this is an opportunity for you to be honestly critical about your own church, and also to tell people, I'm going to help you discern. And if it sounds like this isn't the place for you, I know the folks over at the UCC church down the street. I know the Unity congregation. You know, if you're looking for a little more Jesus, if you're looking for a little more music, maybe you want to try these places out. And that is ministry to your newcomer. That is not a failure when you help someone find their community. And asking to know their story, that's an incredible gesture of hospitality, and you will fall in love with the person for good or for ill, because if they don't come back, then you fall in love with someone who's gone. But it gives you an opportunity to figure out where might be their entree into our congregation. What's their background? Are they ready to offer their skills? Do they just want community? Do they just want friends? Do they want to serve? Are they called to do some service? And this is the place for it. So this is how you can really help them come into the community in a way that they want to, in an individual way, because everyone is different. Just the other images I have on this slide are to remember to give them a name tag if everybody has a name tag, and tell them you can pick up your name tag at the visitors table next Sunday. To sign them up for a newsletter and tell them, I've signed you up for the newsletter. You can unsubscribe at any time. To invite them to connect with you on social media. And then ultimately to connect them with some small groups and some communities where they can really start to make connections. When I began this, I said that part of my plan, when I thought I could have a plan that suited everybody, was to have the visitors and newcomers integrate themselves into our congregation. And what I realized was that we need to be transformed by every newcomer we have, and we need to be open to that. So you need to be able to say to someone, if you feel we need a program and you're willing to start it, let's talk about that. Or if you think we're failing somewhere, tell us and help us to change. If there's something we're ignoring, if there's some group that we're not attending to, please change us. And that's the way the church grows and develops and becomes more and more beautiful in Jesus' eyes. So that's a very exciting thing to do. So I just want to put in that pitch for being open to being transformed by your newcomers. My last slide is just a few resources of wisdom and inspiration, just a very few. And coincidentally, the very first one is an article by Keith Anderson. This was some learnings that we came to when we worked together, 10 things we learned about welcoming newcomers. And it's honestly still the best, pithiest resource that I know of for how to think about newcomers. So I commend that to you very highly. The next one is called Engaging Visitors During the Holidays. This is from the Unitarian Universalist blog, and this is particularly related to Christmas, and you'll see things about the next ask and developing the next ask in there. And then the final thing is another Unitarian Universalist resource. They have an association of people who work with membership primarily. So these are people who are salaried staff people. And they've really developed a bunch of great resources that are free for use. They have webinars, they have tip sheets. They've really thought things out very well, and you can easily translate it to your setting. So those are my 3 things for your further wisdom and inspiration. And I'm ready to hand it off for Greg's rebuttal.
Just before we kick it to Greg, I had a question for you, Diane, because you've served kind of a middle-sized church, I would say, that we work together at, and and then a larger church.
Yeah.
And I wonder, as you were describing those, I was wondering, what are some of the differences you found between working in those different sized churches?
Well, one of them is something, when I had a preview of what Greg's going to talk about, is the ability to know who's a newcomer. That's a big difference. Because in the big church, there are a lot of faces I don't know. And of course, you don't want to offend someone by saying, hi, is this your first time? So what we had to do to accommodate that, is have a visitors table. And we basically are only speaking to people who are willing to come to us. And there are many people who don't want to identify themselves. And that is a great heartbreak and distress to me, but that's the way it is. So I think that's a big difference. Yeah, I think that's the biggest difference. Is there anything that comes to your mind that you're thinking about?
Not exactly. I think you're right. We actually made a similar, as we both moved to bigger churches. And I would say there's just more people to keep track of. Right. So at a mid-sized church, I got to the point where I knew exactly who was new and who was not. And it's just harder, even with family members visiting, with regular members, and keeping track of who's new and who's not is a challenge. And then just managing a larger universe of people, even just keeping track of all the members you have, in addition to keeping track of who's visiting, who came back, who's interested, who are we going to invite to the new members, social and class when it comes up.
Yes, so I do, at my last larger church, I did use a database that prompted me, and that's really helpful.
Nice. Greg, what do you think?
And
Oh, did I cut you off, Diane?
I'm fine, thanks.
Great. Yeah, this is not a rebuttal. This is affirmation of virtually everything you said, Diane. I wanted to, especially two things that I was just going like, yes, 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 amen, amen, is the turning ordinary things into events. I think that was a great idea because I'm at one of those places where we can't really manifest great big events all the time, but so maybe it could be taking down the Christmas decorations. That might be the event coming up, or it might be a baptismal party in January. Who knows? But I thought that was great. And also, the one I'm really interested in is telling us what we aren't doing well, are or are not doing well. And Diane, do you have any anecdotes or any incidences maybe where the feedback from newcomers was, particularly, like you said, transformative or maybe something kind of shocking?
One thing I think of is a newcomer who, after some months, was pretty disappointed in our social justice work.
Mm-hmm.
And she came from a background where she knew what should be done and how it could be done. And it's actually a continuing process for current leaders to step aside and make room for her vision. And I think that's really great for us. It can be uncomfortable and challenging, but I'm so glad she spoke up.
Yeah, absolutely. I wondered, did you have any mechanism, or did you all consider a mechanism where you would try to remember people's faces or learn faces to names, anything like that? Any kind of cheat sheets, for lack of a better word?
No.
Got it.
No, the only thing that I could do, we have name tags, and I say you can ask a person's name 10 times, and then it's your fault if you don't remember. So I will even ask newcomers to remind me who they are. But also, just one easy thing is if I give them a name tag, I say, come to the visitors table to pick it up. So at least we get reinforced the second time.
Exactly.
To know who they are.
Good. So really it keeps everyone on their toes. They've got to be a little more diligent about learning the newcomers' face and names. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I go back and forth about that. That's why I ask. So that's really it I had. I think this is wonderful stuff. It's really, really interesting.
Yeah.
Helpful.
Well, let's see if there are questions and comments. I may have to get out of my sharing for some reason I have to not share my screen in order to see the chat box. Diana asks, how do we develop a group of folks in the congregation who are good at engaging the visitor/newcomer? That's a great question, Diana. Because oftentimes it becomes the pastor's job, the deacon's job, the rector's job, the professional person's job to be that person.
Diana, your question gives me an opportunity to say something I kind of wanted to say, and this was something Keith did early on in his ministry at the church we worked at together. The congregation was not very warm, and he told us that from the pulpit. So, if you have that issue, I highly recommend, if you're the pastor, the minister, the priest, that you do that if you need to do that. That really shapes people up. But you do get to know some people who have that outgoing personality and just cultivate them. And I just recently, I should have done this long ago, but I just recently sat down with 3 people, actually put it on a Facebook group, who can meet with newcomers, who can have coffee with newcomers. And I picked the people that I thought were really most suited for it. And I met with them and we talked about how we do that and how we minister and how we listen to stories. So I think, A, you can shame people into being on better behavior, and B, you can really pick out the few that will help you. And train them. And I refer you back again to the UUAMP resource, which has a lot of information on that topic and will help you to train others to be welcoming.
So I remember that sermon that I gave. It was Reformation Sunday, and there were actually visitors who were in the church at that morning, and I thought, I have surely scared these people away. It was like a young couple, and it turns out she eventually became the council president. And they remained good friends because they said, we had been to this church before and it wasn't welcoming, and we moved and we lived closer to it, so we thought we'd come back and try it again. And they appreciated hearing that hard, thing that I kind of said about, because a lot of times we have a self-perception of ourselves in churches as very welcoming people.
Yeah.
Like, we're very warm, we're very welcoming, everybody, and the reality from what people experience of us can be quite different than that. And so kind of bursting the bubble of our own self-image of ourselves as a congregation, people really took that to heart. It was, people took it hard, but they, in the way that you kind of really do some deep self-reflection, and that helped.
That's great.
Yeah. Elizabeth asks, what database would you suggest?
I have a one-word answer for that: Realm. REALM. And it's provided by either, I forget if the name is ATS Technologies or ACS Technologies. So I apologize that I don't have that exactly right, but I'm sure you can find it easily. I have no particular reason to represent them, but we've tried a few. I've communicated with many other membership professionals who tried others, and we just found that to have more of what you're looking for and fewer problems.
Greg, what do you use?
Don't have one at the moment. So
Okay.
There you go.
Yeah. I'm taking notes.
Paper file, Excel, you name it. Yeah.
We use Shepherd Staff at the moment, which is what our last church used as well. And Diane and I were actually just together recently, and she was telling me about Realm, so we're looking into that. Looks like it has some really good features for keeping people connected. Yeah. All right. Elizabeth has a superhero question for Greg, but we're going to leave that to the end. We're going to come back to that.
Jump into the good stuff.
Yeah, right. The superhero portion of the webinar. So let's share my screen again. Oh, I think there was one more question. Hope I'm not giving people whiplash with this screen sharing. I think another question: what do you think about training greeters to extend a welcome by 1, offering a welcome swag gift, 2, seeing that they are greeted by church leadership, 3, introducing them to people in the pews near them? And I think, Greg, this is leading into some of what you're going to share, right?
Yeah.
So why don't we move to that, and we'll let Greg answer that in the course of his presentation. And if we miss anything, we'll come back to that.
Right.
All right. So let's go to the screens.
Just making a note. Okay.
All right.
Perfect.
There we go. All right. So go ahead, Greg.
Okay, thanks. So I really do want people, I think, lay or clergy, to really think about what is the mission of the church. That should be a capital C. The reason being is, often when you're, and only in a year ago was I in the interview process, and everyone that's at a church that wants to do better with newcomers or visitors says, we want to grow the church and we want newcomers, right? So then when the rubber meets the road and you're actually doing that and they're not quite adapting to the change and the growth and the new faces and some of the regulars, I keep wanting to say old timers, but I'm not going to say old timers, even though I just said it, regular members, when they're having difficulty with that, I'm finding myself more and more having to remind them, you hired me to grow the church, and we said, we all agreed we wanted newcomers. So there's only one way to grow the church is to bring in new people. Unless we can start cloning. So that's just my first thing. I mean, that's ultimately, if I had to step back and say, what is the mission of the church? It's to grow the church. It's to make, realize the heavenly kingdom on earth. And that's something you're going to have to hold your congregation to, whether you're a lay leader or a clerical leader. I do think there's a couple problems, though. I think if you really step back and think about it, only the clergy, speaking from experience here, only the clergy are really best equipped to recognize a newcomer, because the clergy are the ones that are at all services. If you're in a smaller church and you're the only clergy, you're going to be at every service, so you'll know who's there or not there, or who's missing, and you're also going to be able to identify better who the new faces are. That's not to say you're going to be good at that. You may recognize a face, and it may be somebody that's a complete stranger, or on the flip side, the worst side, you may not recognize someone that's been coming for several weeks or so. But really, the clergy sometimes are at a vantage point, and the clergy need to be reminded that the lay leadership and the regular members in the pews aren't going to be as equipped as they are. So you really do have to kind of work with your congregation about these things. The other problem is you have to, let's see, I think there is a piece missing. Engage and welcome a newcomer or visitor without, without, there it is, ta-da, smothering or ignoring. And Diane was hinting at this too. I think there's a fine line between getting really excited about a newcomer and overwhelming them with things when they've just walked in to try to sit down for a nice little solemn mass, and here you are saying, here's this, fill out this card, here's a gift bag, what's your name, put on this name tag, go sit here, why don't you sit up here, you could try this seat, blah, blah, blah. That I've seen that happen, and that can be overwhelming for somebody. On the flip side, there is obviously a huge thing to be said about when you ignore a newcomer and pay little attention to them. That's like ignoring the elephant in the room. I'm going to give a quick anecdote from my current location or my current setting. A family went to Christmas Eve a year ago, and according to their account, that nobody greeted them. They were brand new visitors. Nobody from the church, not the clergy, even though it was an interim or supply priest at the time. None of the lay leaders, none of the bishop's committee or vestry. Nobody said, hi, who are you? What's your name? Welcome. And Keith, you were just talking about that too a second ago. If you get somebody back a second time, that is gold. Because I think if somebody has a bad experience at church, I usually assume they're gone and they're not ever coming back. This family came back when I started to check out the new guy. That's one of the bits of capital you have if you're the new clergy. You have a honeymoon period of people checking out the new guy or the new girl to kind of figure out, is this going to be the same kind of place, or what are we going to get? What kind of sermon is this going to be like? And these people then were welcome, thank God, but have been able to share with us, by the way, this is our second time coming, and the first time you all didn't even acknowledge our presence here. So that was a wake-up call. That was a realization that you really do have to be paying attention to newcomers. You can't just ignore them and just assume that they're going to be happy with the sermon and they'll be back. That's not the case at all. And let's see, we can go to the next slide. So here's my suggestions, and I can't stress enough that I am not an academic, and I am also not, I don't have very much experience, but if there's any credential, I think this is the reason the Center for Ministry and Teaching reached out to me. I've got a congregation with an ASA, that's Episcopal language for average Sunday attendance, and something that unfortunately the church really focuses on as a measurement of data of how you're doing as a church. That's all. That's another discussion for another time, of course, whether or not that's valid. But it is what it is. And our ASA, when I started, was 40, and now our ASA is 63. So percentage-wise, that's pretty good. I'm trying to get our vestry to understand that that's a great thing to build upon. So in the last year, I've tried to look back and say, what of that was the quote unquote honeymoon of the new clergy, and what of that was real tangible results from a welcoming community? So these are what I've identified, and I may be off base, and I'm excited to hear anybody's critique or pushback on these too. But this is what I do. I begin by assuming there is someone new at every worship service, even the 8 o'clock or 7:45. Even if you recognize all the faces, I think it's helpful to pretend and put on the hat that you are participating in a service where there are new people there, whether you're the clergy or you're in the pews. And that is, I didn't put it in here at all, but I'm glad Diane did. The name tags is huge. I've resisted it, and we've started doing it, and it's been a life changer. And we're moving to permanent name tags as well. And the name tags are most helpful, not for the newcomers, but for the regular members who are trying to learn the newcomers' names. That's really important too. I think based on, think about things and how your service goes, or how particularly your announcements go, where the announcements show up in your service. If, like many churches, the announcements are kind of in the middle of the service. Depending on who does the announcements, in our church, it's the members of the vestry do the announcements. They take turns. I've noticed from time to time, sometimes there's in-jokes and references to things that newcomers have no idea what you're talking about. That goes for liturgy or worship as well. If you're referencing things, for Episcopalians, too much of the word Eucharist and you get glazed faces. Sometimes you have to say communion. I mean communion. So be mindful of those things. I definitely think it's important to have someone greet newcomers and visitors on entry, if you can. That means a system with leaflets. This is where we get into the smothering category, though. Don't smother them, but help them to the things they need, which is usually finding a seat and getting a leaflet. So getting acclimated and helping those greeters to know that they're the front line. They are the first thing the person's going to remember about the church, besides maybe whether or not parking was hard. Then it'll be the people. So let's go to the next slide. Giving away all my trade secrets. We started doing a welcome card that, as I jokingly say, when the sermons are getting a little boring, if somebody needs to, wander, their eyes need to wander, this is something they can look at and maybe consider filling out. And it's a simple welcome that just quickly gives them a couple of sentences about what this church is all about. Is intentional about saying welcome, make that the first word. That would be helpful. An opportunity to opt in for newcomers to very simple things like being on a newsletter. If your congregation is doing a weekly e-newsletter, that's a great way for a newcomer to get acclimated to the community a little faster and kind of see what's going on. So I also try to make it a point to draw people's attention to this card. If it's maybe not their first time, but if I see them a second time, I definitely want to make sure they leave with one of these cards in their hands. Although, sometimes people do fill them out in the first time. If your church does do communion, make sure that the clergy or someone else explains what happens next in a very formalized way, as in like the announcements or right before communion. Here's what's going to happen. If you wish to come forward for a blessing, do this. We have gluten-free wafers. I'm not saying I'm good at this, by the way. If your church is accepting of anyone to receive communion, that's probably important to let the newcomers know. Give you by way of example, I'm in an area that is incredibly Irish Catholic. I'm in the shadow almost of some major Catholic churches and a couple of mega churches on the other end of the theological spectrum. So when we get newcomers, it's often people looking for a change from those, or people that have felt that they kind of got lost in the shuffle at the big churches. But by and large, and I know if anybody here was raised Catholic or knows and had family members that are Catholic or is Catholic, they know that it's those who are Catholic that come to church at a different denomination have a lot of questions about communion and how that works and if they're allowed to receive it. So you want to be prepared up front to explain that. so that they feel really welcome at the table, not just in the pews. In my humble opinion, IMHO, I really don't suggest singling out newcomers or visitors on their first visit. That actually happened to me. Now, I've navigated that somehow and ended up becoming a priest, but I was definitely embarrassed, and that was about 20 years ago. I don't think, even if they're the most outgoing, gregarious visitor or newcomer, I don't know if it's just, I just don't feel in my heart that it's appropriate to make them stand up and introduce themselves to the whole congregation. It's already enough that they got themselves out of bed, in the car. If they have children, that they got them dressed and all. For heaven's sake, just let them take it all in. Don't put them on the spot. Some may disagree, so we'll come back to that. Okay, next slide. Do consider a gift bag. Diane mentioned this too. I think it's a great idea, and I'm trying to get our church to get to this point. We just need material to put in it. We did recently make some coffee mugs, and I think that's something like that. So that's what I mean by swag. T-shirts, if your church has anything emblematic of the church, especially if it's got information like the website, the phone number, a business card stashed in there for the clergy or the lay leadership. If you want to put in a welcome card or some kind of newcomer form, that's great. I'd strongly suggest you hold off on putting in the stewardship form into the gift bag. That's a bit of a jump right there. Give them some time on that. But consider that, and you know, that would take some work to figure out who is going to distribute the bag, who's going to know for sure if this is a newcomer or not, so that you don't embarrass somebody by mistake. But it's worth considering and worth doing. I think that your leaflets, your banners, if you've got them outside, definitely should explain the regular worship service schedules. What I mean is, I'm talking specifically about Christmas services. Somewhere in there, you've got, I think Diane's point about putting in major events in the community is great. But you really do need to make sure people know what the regular worship schedule is, because not that they're all going to come back Mondays at 4 o'clock or 10 o'clock, but make sure they know what's next. And what's next is December 30th, and that might be a strange service time depending on your congregation or your setting. But what happens after the season of Christmas is over? When can they come to church, and what's the right service for them? So I think that's important. And announcements, I think this was particularly about in a leaflet or in the bulletin. So along the lines of what Diane was suggesting, consider if you've got a lot of families on Christmas Eve, which usually is the case, maybe highlight the family-oriented things coming up. Maybe it's not too soon to put in the dates for a vacation Bible school, or reinforce the idea that there's Sunday school every week, if that's the case. And if you can, or if you haven't, then now's the time to plant a flag for a spring newcomers course or a inquirers course, it's sometimes called, to help people get acclimated to whatever faith tradition you're worshiping in. And I think that's, they should know that those dates are coming up. In fact, I already get questions about that already from newcomers in the last year. I think there's another slide. Yes. This is consistent with what you've heard so far and what Diana said. I just, math is hard, so I just try to pick a number, and I don't know, 3, that seems like a good number. Seems like a holy number. So within 3 days, make sure somebody has reached out by email, phone, handwritten notes, which is becoming more and more like gold when people receive a handwritten note. I think incidentally, I get more people thanking me in person for a handwritten note than anything else in the life of our community. And I don't know if they're just impressed that I wrote a note, who knows, or maybe it's my handwriting, but handwritten notes do mean a lot. But some contact should be made with the newcomer or visitor if they've given you their information, of course, within 3 days, I think. And do consider an online forum, or a form is really what I meant to say, where someone can submit their information to learn more. Not necessarily a new member form, but like a welcome form or something, maybe on your website where they can type in, or maybe linked in your newsletter if they've opted to sign into that newsletter. I do think there needs to be some second follow-up, and this is the part where it's not easy and hard to remember, but you want to follow up again 3 weeks later, especially definitely follow up 3 weeks later period, and just say, we've enjoyed having you. Is there anything else we can be doing? Any other questions we can ask? But if you hear nothing and it's been 3 weeks and you don't see them, I really do think they're gone. They may pop back in Christmas and Easter, who knows? But I think if somebody was really interested in church shopping, if you don't see them again, the odds are that they're not coming back. And that's a reality, I think, to face. But I'm ready for pushback on that one. And then I do think it's really important that we worked on this at my previous church and the church I was kind of raised in Los Angeles, of doing a newcomers brunch or a tea, or I'm calling it a soiree, which means alcoholic and non-alcoholic drinks. And we do that maybe once or twice a year, fall and spring. I did most recent one at my home to kind of get them out of the church setting and have them feel especially welcome and down to earth. And my husband was there, and I wanted them to see that the church, the fabric of the community goes a little bit beyond the four walls of the sanctuary. And it's a great opportunity for newcomers to get to know each other, because newcomers don't necessarily know who else is new. Everyone's new to them. So when you get them all in a room together and they can actually meet each other, then they have some skin in the game. They can actually maybe even sit with that person. And I've seen that happen too, where now they recognize, okay, I'm not alone here. I am also part of a community of the newcomers and all. I think that's the end of my part of the slide. Oh no, God, I keep going. Oh, that was backwards. Good. I can't stress enough that something that Diane had said just about receiving the feedback from newcomers. I think that's not only giving feedback is hard, receiving the feedback in a positive way is especially hard. And that one couple that came on Christmas Eve last year and had a bad experience and was not welcome, but did come back, is now my most trusted newcomers, where they can tell me what we're not doing well or what we could be doing better on the newcomer visitor front. And I think they are absolutely essential to the life of this church. They also started pledging. So there's a happy ending to some of these things if you've made a mistake. But back to what Diane was saying, being assertive is definitely going to be rewarded. I think I should stop there for now and see what questions we have.
Great. Thank you. That's great content. Diane, do you want to respond? And you'll have to unmute yourself there.
I can read lips. It's okay.
There I go. Among the things that I love that Greg said was to expect visitors at every service. And I forget at what point we've done that in the churches I've worked at, but it is transformative just to have the minister tell you that this is why I'm doing this. We have visitors every Sunday, and to have people expect that is really great and somehow opens our hearts, which may have been closed. It's just wonderful. And I also appreciate your advice after to get in touch with the person after 3 weeks. If you hear nothing, they're probably gone, because we have to learn how to let go of our visitors too, how to do that without feeling bad and still being gracious. I want to say, there's an advantage to a visitor's table if that's something you folks can work in your church, because what I find comfortable is if someone comes to the visitor's table before the service, I say, if you like the service, come back. Here's where you can give us your name, etc. Or I can say, come back after the service and tell me how you liked it, what you thought of it, because I want an unbiased opinion on what we're offering here. And that's when I can then engage them in, here's our newsletter, here's our blah, blah, blah. So that's a nice place for them to engage that way. Mm-hmm. And I do want to say that I think Diana was asking about swag, and you're doing the swag. I never got significant oomph from swag, so I no longer do it.
Got it. Good to know.
Yeah, with swag, sometimes it's because everything is online and people have visited the church website usually before they've arrived at the church. It's sometimes hard to know what to include in swag, because they probably read it on the website. I think at Redeemer we had some version. Oh, I like that.
That's what we had.
Yeah. Oh, nice. And you can even do the mug and have something in the you were saying, the business card and some information, a magnet or something.
Right.
So it doesn't have to be, because there's so much online, it doesn't have to be a whole pamphlet, but just something to point people in the right direction on the website. Some churches have like a "Are you new here?" first time visiting kind of button or tab, so you could send people to your website address slash visitor slash newcomer slash whatever.
Right.
Yeah.
Great.
Janine is saying that they say when someone comes back a second time, we greet them with the same enthusiasm as the first and ask, "What brought you back?" Please discuss what you think about that question. What do you think?
Yeah, it's a good idea. Just think, just be careful of the timing. Just like I'm clergy, so I can only speak from clergy sometimes, but just like I don't want to be bombarded at 2 minutes before the service starts, be careful about asking somebody to answer a deep question at 8:58 or whatever, right before your service begins. But if there is a good time, like a coffee hour or something, where you can say, "We're so glad you're back. What brought you back?" Or that's certainly valuable. Absolutely.
That's a wonderful question, Janine. And it also reminds me that folks might want to do a little focus group with their latest batch of newcomers to see what's working and what's appealing to people.
Yeah, I think Diane and I used to do a newcomers brunch, which now we do at my church here, that after, say, 6 months, we would do a brunch on a Sunday morning for people who have joined in the last year.
Great.
Like we do it maybe twice a year, and we bring them together and check in and see how they're doing, what they get involved in. And then we ask for their feedback on the newcomers process, and how could we adjust it or tweak it? Because those are our best experts, are the people who just joined, who just went through it, as opposed to the people that joined 20 years ago, and it may have been a very different experience.
Yeah.
Yeah. Diana asks, how important is church website versus Facebook versus Twitter? It's too difficult for us to maintain all three with current info, which is most important. I have lots of thoughts, but I'll kick it to you guys first. Do you have thoughts on that?
Over to you, Keith.
I can say that we do, we've recently updated our website, and we also very much rely on our Facebook page. We actually have two. We have a closed group, and we also have a a professional page that you like. Mm-hmm. We tend to use that one more with like announcements and things. So, for example, this is a very Chicago problem. There's 2 feet of snow. Services are available tomorrow, but if you can't make it, come back for Facebook Live or something like that. It is hard to keep up. You need somebody dedicated. If it depends on, there's so many factors. It depends on the size of your church. It depends on if you've got a staff and somebody's willing to do it. If you've got somebody in the congregation or on a vestry or bishop's committee that is willing to do it and commit to it, at least even weekly, is huge. I mean, you don't want to be carrying the Easter dates right now on your websites. If your websites don't have the Christmas services scheduled, you should stop right now and go fix that. Right?
Yes.
For example, it's hard to maintain, but it is important because people Google. That's one of the quick ways people figure out what church they're going to, and sometimes it's just based on distance, and they read reviews. I think all of that's important. So social media is huge, and the Facebook, for us, the experiment of Facebook is just a great way to get immediate information out to people. So we do that a lot versus emails.
Yeah. I would say part of it also depends on your context. So if your demographic is younger, or you have a large number of younger people in your church, young adults, you might think about Instagram more than Facebook. So look at your demographic. By and large, Facebook is going to get your most bang for your buck, but you're going to miss out on young adults if you just do that. But for me, I think the website is hugely important, and it's still probably, because we talk about social media a lot, we sometimes underestimate the importance of a good website. So I think that's really the place that, if you have a limited amount of time, I guess we all do, that's where I would put my time, is in the website, and make it clean, make it welcoming, make it really explanatory, talk about what you do and what you mean, what you believe, and really down-to-earth ways.
Yep.
You know, sometimes you go to church websites and they're really formal and these big statements of faith, and, you know, people you need to meet people at square one.
Right.
And then maybe point them to deeper resources. But I think put your time and effort into the website. I think that's because people might find you on Facebook, but they'll go to your website to see more, I think, to get a more accurate depiction.
And Keith, can I add that also with the website, don't discredit things. Like, you want information in there, but the aesthetics and what images you're showing really, really matter.
Yeah.
It gives them a window into what your church is like. We switched recently from WordPress. I know probably a lot of people on here know WordPress. We switched to Squarespace, and I'm not being paid by Squarespace, but I'm thrilled with Squarespace because it's very elegant, and images really are used really well. So if you've got pictures of your congregation, Squarespace is the way to go, and it's very cost effective. It's about $20 a month or something. That's about it. So
yeah, I would agree. I just done some projects with Squarespace and liked it a lot. And Weebly is a little less elegant, but same kind of drag and drop idea. And yeah, you can get a ton of mileage for not a lot of money now, and they're much more easier to use than they used to be. Corrine has a question. We often get folks who don't sign in on our friendship pads or pew pads, so figuring out names is challenging. Any advice on getting folks to sign in? We ask the congregation to sign in members and visitors, but folks don't always do it. Any motivational wording, suggestions on getting folks to write down their info?
Some people just aren't going to do it. And unfortunately, it's their loss. I'm thinking about people who've been coming to our church for 2 years, never identify themselves, and then ask why they're not being included in it. With my heart. So again, I personally would find going to the visitors table and doing a special visitors card more amenable than signing in during the service. And then you can also have a conversation. So you might want to just try that as a different thing and see if you have more success.
right. I think also if you've got someone in the congregation dedicated to greeting, whether it's an usher or anything like that, it's totally okay. No one's going to be mad that you handed them a piece of paper and put it in their hand, I don't think. So as they're leaving, it's not, and I learned this at St. Paul's Alexandria, and I know some of them are watching, so I want them the credit for this, but the lay leadership there will put these welcome cards in their hands and say, at least take it. You know, if you take it, you might consider, you know, and they may, in most cases, about 75% of the time, they pull out a pen and say, well, let me just do it right now, you know. Mm-hmm. It's again about being assertive. There's no shame in just handing somebody and make sure they hand the card. You can lead a horse to water, we can't make them drink, right? Although we're not supposed to say that anymore from PETA.
We have, so it's funny, at our last, when Diane and I were at Redeemer, we got rid of the pew pads. We had or maybe I just did that before Diane started. But we didn't use pew pads, but it was small enough that you really could tell who was who. And we had a sign-in book. So rather than the pew pads that got passed along at the offering, there was a visitor's book. And that was actually, for me, more helpful because it was a centralized place instead of all the papers that get collected across 3 different services. And but we do have pew pads at my current church. And I think some of the things I say to encourage people are, you know, if you want to be on our weekly email list and receive our latest news information, you can include your email address. We promise not to spam you. So then people chuckle at that. So, you know, because I think you want to avoid being creepy. Like, don't say like, we want all your personal information. You know, like sometimes it can come out that way, even though in your head you think you're not.
Right. And what's your mother's maiden name?
Yeah. And then I think part of the intention too is that, you know, when you pass it down, you'll get to know the names of the people in your pew. So part of it is to get to know the people in your pew that very morning. And I probably am less good about lifting that part of it up, but it helps us to know the people in our pew and connect during the week. So might be some language that could help.
And I was not familiar with pew pads. That's why I didn't.
Oh yeah.
So that's new for me.
It's yeah. I mean, I think there's a whole kind of post-paper digital, you know, kind of opportunity, but I don't know what that is quite yet. But some people still have them. Thanks for that question. Aaron says, welcoming the stranger is a calling of all Christians. How do you encourage the congregation to engage in welcoming newcomers, even if they aren't a formal part of the ministry, like greeters?
Yeah. Diane?
I don't have any really interesting answers. I know that some of our ministers do a great job of talking about that from the pulpit. And then there's the, someone in your congregation can say, let's all get together and talk about how we're doing this. And it's a responsibility. I don't have a really stirring answer. So either of you two?
The first thing I think of is name tags. And, there is a spectrum of your regular worshipers or members, of their involvement in newcomers. I guess is the way to say that. And I think, Diane, you were talking about this earlier, where you've got to really identify who's really good at it, who's just naturally outgoing, and it doesn't have to be outgoing, but is naturally inclined to speak to a newcomer, and who's not. So those people should definitely be put in some kind of leadership job with that, to that respect. For everyone else, I really just try to tell them to put a name tag on. That's the least they can do, is put a name tag on. And some people don't even want to do that. I've been coming here for 40 years, that's fine. Okay, so they're not going to be very helpful. That's fine. And then, I think one of the hardest things to do, and it's like cyclical. It's like you're back in middle school or something. You've got to go kind of break up the cliques a little bit. If there's a coffee hour phenomenon where the 4 or 5 people that see each other only once a week, they're all catching up. What'd you do to your roof? Blah, blah, blah. How's school? You kind of somebody has to get in there. It doesn't have to just be the clergy. Just say, there's some newcomers over there. Why don't you guys go mingle? That's really hard to do, both to receive that and also be the one to break that up. But it does help to strategically pick a few people in advance and maybe just go ahead and assign them with a permanent name tag or something that says that I'm designated to be the mingler. That's it. It's hard. So I guess my answer would be name tags, but there's always going to be somebody that just is just, in their own little space in worship and isn't going to be very friendly, and that we love them too. So.
Yeah, I think the dynamic on a Sunday morning is just really interesting. It's like all of our human insecurities come out.
Yeah.
Like when we're like even for those who come every Sunday, like we're all worried about, are we going to be accepted? Are we going to feel welcome, comfortable, uncomfortable? Who's going to initiate? Am I going to approach somebody else? Is somebody going to approach me? And I just feel like, there's like the chat, and it's really nice at coffee hour. Maybe I'm saying that because I experienced that too. I'm an introvert that's a functional extrovert in ministry. And so I have to kind of move myself beyond my comfort zone to kind of do that. And then I go take a nap after church. But yeah, I think like kind of just recognizing that if you're coaching people along in your church and they're feeling kind of nervous and apprehensive, it's like, well, the newcomers feel even more so, right? So you're right there with them. You can relate to where they're at and reach out to them.
I have something to add. Just teach every single person in your church to not to say, "Are you new?" but to just say, "I don't think we've met. I'm Diane."
Right.
That is one thing that everyone can learn, and you can just reiterate that over and over again to make people feel comfortable with that, so no one else is put on the spot.
Good.
I should say another trick I do, I'm sorry I'm giving away all my secrets, but I do sometimes begin, and I learned this from another priest once about 20 years ago. I sometimes begin with, we've met before, right? And then they say no, and I'm like, oh, I'm sorry, you just look familiar. But then if you have met, you're covered. So, and it's a little like cheeky way to kind of cover your, what. Yeah.
Let me ask we have a couple new questions. This one kind of follows on what we're talking about. Benjamin asked, do you think the welcome committee and the coffee hour committee are tied together or not?
Depends on context, probably. They could be, absolutely. Depends on just how you're, let's say, take Sunday morning, for example, and how is it structured? Some churches are big enough where there's multiple things happening all at once. Some churches have one main service, even if they have a few services, one main worship service with a significant coffee hour afterwards. If that's my current situation. If that's the case, then yes, welcome and coffee go together hand in hand. I want the person and in our church, we take turns putting out the treats and the coffee and everything. I want those people to be in charge of greeting. I don't want them hiding in the kitchen. And that's turning out to be the hardest thing ever. Because sometimes if they've got something to do in the kitchen, they're going to default to that if they're introverted. And I'm threatening to lock the kitchen, actually. So, so it depends on the context. That was my answer, but it certainly could be. Yeah.
I think it's nice to have people, like at our church, there's a lot of people that just flag things. And it could be somebody who's at the coffee bar, or who's an usher or greeter, or just regulars that notice things and say, oh, hey, did you, sometimes they'll introduce me to the person if they've already had a conversation with them, or say, hey, that person over there, or even stuff with our members, they seem, something going on, or, with them, could you follow up? So just to have some eyes and ears, because I find it just hard, like just running the services and keeping things running on time, moving between worship services over the course of a morning. It's just hard to concentration wise, I think, be aware of some of the dynamics, and who's new and who's not, and kind of what's going on, because you're just thinking about, I'm finishing this service up, I'm getting ready for the next service and getting back into the next service. Paul asks, have you ever used Twitter during a worship service to get responses from members of the congregation and share them during worship? What do you think about that idea? Any of you?
Nope. Too much going on.
Yeah. I think I did it in a sermon once. And there are apps or websites where you can do that. You can give people a number to text, or you can do it by Twitter. You could also, there are texting services. Huh?
Like American Idol?
Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah. So you could text, and it'll show, because so many more people text obviously than do Twitter. So you could get a service and you say, text to this number and respond to the question of whatever. And you could have them, if you have screens, you could have them display during church. Or you could ask people, what they would like. I think I forget what my prompt was, but you could do that. I think that's a good idea. There's a balance between kind of enhancing and distracting. Yep. It's like divided attention. Right. So I think there's an art to that. I don't do it too much. I can barely concentrate on my manuscript sometimes. Yeah. I think those are all the questions, and we're a little past 4. So let me come back to sharing my screen here and let people know what's coming up. So our next webinar is coming up on January 16th, 3 p.m. That's our usual time, 3 p.m. Eastern. And we're talking about being church beyond the building with Kyle Oliver, who's long been associated with VTS and lifelong learning, and he's teaching a module on missional faith formation, which is all about kind of faith formation beyond the building. And Emily Scott, who started St. Lydia's Dinner Church in Brooklyn and is now starting a new church in Baltimore. So both deeply involved in evangelism and faith formation beyond church buildings. And just to let everybody know that this recording, our slides, and all the links will be available on Building Faith, which is at buildfaith.org. And that'll be coming out in the next week. We'll get all those packaged together and posted online. And all of the webinars that we do going back are there too. So things on Advent and stewardship and technology and teens, all of that is available on the Building Faith website. Just want to thank Greg and Diane for sharing your experiences and wisdom with us today. It's great things to be able to think about. Even as you were sharing, there were just a number of things I wrote down myself as I was listening that would be good to tweak or implement or consider.
Yeah.
So thank you both.
Thank you.
Great. And just a reminder, check us out on Building Faith. Look for us on the next webinar, and you can find all of our resources at btslifelong.org, at eFormation, and at Building Faith. Thank you all for being with us today. We think had about 55 participants at our peak. I know some people had to go at the top of the hour. So thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.